Queen Cersei Lannister is my second favorite viewpoint character in A Song of Ice and Fire, excluding the obvious. She's very different from her television counterpart. Her television counterpart is exceptionally more put together. We're never in her head, so we're not directly exposed to a lot of what we're exposed to with book Cersei. And I think that Lena Headey's performance also does a great job of kind of allowing her to carry the show for points and be a pretty compelling kind of mastermind villain. In the books, Cersei's kind of all over the place. Her chapters in A Feast for Crows, the fourth book in the series, where she kind of acts as a main character, or the main character, involve her essentially bouncing from one political scheme to the next, all of which end up completely blowing up in her face. It's an insane comedy of errors that I love thoroughly and have for years. With that said, just exactly how bad of a job does Cersei do in these chapters? How many times does Cersei Lannister make incorrect assumptions? How many times does she put forward plans that are very clearly going to go terribly? How many times is Cersei Lannister wrong in A Feast for Crows? It's important to go over what exactly I'm tracking here. It is fairly subjective, and I'll try to give my thought process for each of these errors being counted as errors as they go, but this is pretty much the errors column of a baseball game. In order to qualify as Cersei being wrong about something, there has to be a more correct answer that could be used in place of her assumption or assertion. Her thoughts and actions both count, and for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to repeat errors. She thinks about people plotting against her approximately a billion times throughout A Feast for Crows, but I'm limiting it to unique instances of doing so. Tyrion being in the walls is only going to count once. Her thing about the Tyrell coin is only going to count once. Tactical blunders and objectively terrible decisions are also going to be counted as being wrong because it's more fun that way. Cersei I. Her first outing is quite quaint as far as errors go, as it's a fairly short chapter. Fun fact, this was the first chapter of Feast for Crows ever read to the public, I think back in 2002. It mostly deals with the aftermath of Tywin Lannister's death, as Cersei Lannister jumps from one paranoid assumption to another as the pages progress. Her first mistake is a fairly innocuous one. Cersei is awoken from a nightmare by a Kingsguard. She thinks it's Jaime. It's actually Sir Osmond Kettleblack, and I think that might speak to the two's roles kind of reversing in this book. Second, she starts thinking about Loras, which ties in her mind to the fact that the Tyrells could have been behind Tyrion's escape and Tywin's death. They were not, as far as we know, though we don't have a Tyrell viewpoint in any of the books. Less than a page later, she thinks that Stannis might have killed Tywin by way of a catspaw in order to launch another attack on the city. Again, doesn't seem to be the case, though we do have Stannis viewpoints here. Fourth up, I don't really blame her for this error, but she thinks that Tywin has no use for Shae, as he was above such vices as beset his father and son. He definitely projected that image, but that image is kind of facially incorrect. She thinks that Shae was there to be questioned about Sansa, and I really like that Tyrion's voice in her head immediately points out that this clashes with reality, that Shae is naked, showing that Tyrion is kind of warging Cersei for the entire book. It really explains all of her incorrect decisions here. Following this, Cersei asserts that the murders couldn't possibly be Tyrion, and is immediately proven wrong by a search of his cell. She doesn't think he escaped, he did. Thus begins a trend of Cersei incorrectly assuming that Tyrion is everywhere in the castle and working for everyone at all times. Cersei II. Her first error here is her wistfully thinking that more people are going to appear to mourn Tywin later. Hints of the truth poke through her thoughts, but her admiration for her father drowns out the reputation that he'd made for himself with the common man. Second, we technically don't know whether this one is correct or will be correct or not, but Cersei thinks that in 1,000 years, Tywin will only be remembered as the father of Queen Cersei. Based on her track record in power throughout this book, I'm putting this assertion as far more unlikely than likely in terms of being just somewhat of a falsehood or delusion. 3. When surveying the Tyrell court, Cersei seems to imply that Margaery is sleeping with her handmaidens. Incorrect as far as we know, but not that there's anything wrong with that. Fourth up, Cersei immediately seizes on Varys' bait. He planted a coin from the Reach in the black cells of this jailer named Rugen, who probably was Varys, trying to convince the queen that the Tyrells were somehow involved in the imp's escape. As I mentioned, she immediately believes this. Fifth, I'd completely forgotten about this one, but I think it's my favorite error so far. Cersei thinks that Tyrion hired Pycelle to make Tyrion's corpse smile and stink at the funeral. Sixth up, Cersei thinks that Giles Rosby is going to be a good master of coin because he's rich and his horses are well dressed. This is proven wrong pretty quickly. He's ineffectual at best and actively bad at worst by way of enabling Cersei's terrible spending habits. Seventh, and finally for this chapter, after Cersei throws wine in his face, Kevin suggests that Mathis Rowan and Randall Tarley would be good potential hands for Tommen, which makes Cersei think that he's working for the Tyrells. He isn't. That ends the errors in Cersei II, but I do want to say something I love about the ending of this chapter. Kevin revealing that he knows about the twin test by saying that Tommen has his father around too, and then immediately transitioning into Jaime's vigil is great. I think that Martin does a great job with his writing generally. I like it. Jaime I. Surprise, Cersei doesn't just appear in her own chapters. With that said, not being in her head limits the number of conspiracy theories the reader is exposed to at any given time. We only get one in that chapter, and that one is that Cersei suggests that Tyrion was the one who told Kevin about her relationship with Jaime. We're in both Tyrion's head and Kevin's head at various points in the story, and there is zero evidence to support that point. So, not likely. I think he probably just has eyes and isn't as delusional as his older brother Tywin. Cersei III is a rather quaint chapter, only housing 4 errors therein. First up, on the eve of Tommen's wedding, Cersei asserts that Tyrion is hiding in the floor, ready to pop up and kill the king by some means other than poison, because he wouldn't kingslay the same way twice. Tyrion would never use poison again. Don't ask Nurse about that particular fact. Second up, Cersei decides to burn the Tower of the Hand, partially because she thinks that Tyrion, Varys, and Rugen are living in the walls, spying on her. We know that Tyrion isn't in the walls. We can confirm that one. Varys and Rugen are likely in the walls. Varys and Rugen are probably the same person, but we know that they're not living in the walls of specifically the Hand's Tower, as they are not burned to death as of the end of A Dance with Dragons. 3. I'm going to count trusting Taina that her handmaiden is working for Marjorie based on zero evidence as an error, as there's no indication as to whether this claim is correct or not, and based on her layer of betrayal, I'm going to say that Taina's counsel here is probably false. Fourth and finally, continuing the trend of paranoia about the Tyrells and Kevin, Cersei sees Garland having a conversation with her uncle and immediately assumes they're plotting to fill her council with roses or something of the sort. There's no indication that this is the case. They're probably just polite and making party chat. Hello, I'd like to interrupt your regularly scheduled programming for 2 quick announcements. First and foremost, I've been making playlists for A Song of Ice and Fire characters I really like. I always did this with my D&D characters, and I thought it'd be fun to do it here too. I've done one for Jon Con, one for Stannis, and I am putting out one for Cersei in this video too. It's just a bunch of songs that I think really capture her story, elements of her personality, things that have happened to her. I always enjoyed doing it for those characters that I've made, so I figured it'd be fun to do it for here as well. Additionally, I did also just want to ask if you enjoy the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this video, this format, anything like that in the comments down below. Back to the regularly scheduled Cersei. Jaime II. I'm going to treat Cersei's dismissal of Uncle Kevin as an error here, because it is such a massive, unforced blunder. He's been so incredibly useful to Tywin for so long, but Cersei ignores him entirely, despite Jaime bringing up a number of relevant uses for him. We also learn of a bunch of Cersei's council appointments for the first time this chapter, and I'm counting many of those as errors on her part, which I'll get to in a second. With that said, I'm not counting Qyburn as an error. He's uniquely loyal to Cersei and specifically useful, despite causing a billion more errors later down the line via the information he gives to his queen, which she immediately interprets in exactly the wrong way. Second error is Hand of the King pick Orton Merryweather. Cersei says he's weak and can be dominated, and while that could be kind of correct, he also clearly has his own game going on, as evidenced by him later vanishing in Cersei's time of need, and several of his other actions, and his wife's other actions throughout the text. She also pitches Pyromancer Helene as a good potential hand, and I'm counting that as an error based on knowing him and knowing the past precedent of Pyromancer hands in the Seven Kingdoms. Fourth and finally, Orain Waters as Master of Ships. Enough said. He's hot though, so, points to Cersei for that. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the big one. It's Cersei IV, the moment you've all been waiting for. I'm going to try to do this in one take, so grab a snack, sit down, get comfortable. We're going to be here a while. First and foremost, Tyrion is apparently hiding in the Sept of Baelor, tolling the bell, which explains Season 8, Episode 5. Also, I am like 40% confident she was joking here, but it's hard to tell, so I'm counting it. Cersei then thinks that she's uprooted every Rose, every Tyrell supporter on the small council, which is likely false, as at least 2 of her counselors are actively working for the Tyrells at this very point. Third, Cersei thinks that the Sparrows are outraged with Stannis, calling him a demon worshipper specifically. In fact, they're outraged for a number of things, some of which involve Stannis, some of which involve her, in the alleged incest and the killing of Ned Stark on the steps of the Great Sept of Baelor. Later on, more discussion is had about the potential High Septon, the future choice that is left to the High people in the faith. She thinks that it will be Septon Torbert or Septon Reynard. Both of these end up being mistakes. We catch up with one of these individuals later in the book who's scrubbing the floor of the Great Sept. Another is being starved in a dungeon, neither of which is the High Sparrow, neither of which is the High Septon, and neither of which is doing well. Cersei then announces that one High Septon will serve as well as another. In addition to being generally ironic given the High Sparrow and what happens later, it contradicts her own thinking about the perceived evil of the previous High Septon, who was appointed by Tyrion, who was apparently bad enough that Cersei had to get one of the Kettleblacks to murder him, which again bites her in the ass later. She also kicks the can down the road regarding the Sparrows, calling them the Faith's problem, not hers. Eighth, Cersei decides to build a new fleet for the crown rather than seeking allies in the Redwynes or the Greyjoys. It's an okay decision on its own, but given the current political and economic environment, it is a massive error. 9. Cersei defaults on the crown's debt to the faith until the war's end. 10. Cersei defaults on the crown's debt to the Iron Bank until the war's end. These 2 decisions are, I would say, the biggest mistakes that any viewpoint character makes in the entire series. 11. She decides to forestall any punishment for the Red Wedding until after Walder Frey's death, which further strengthens the accurate public perception that the Lannisters were directly involved in this act that is now so reviled by the realm. 12. Cersei forgets about Sansa and then goes on a half-page long rant about how much she wants to torture this 12-year-old girl. I wouldn't normally count that forgetfulness as an error, but her losing her tact does reveal a bit more of her nature to the constituents and does create an awkward silence. Also, it's funny, so I'm counting it. 13. Cersei lets Arayn Waters crew his ships with criminals who would otherwise be bound to the Night's Watch. For reasons that will become apparent, bad idea. 14. Cersei dismisses Arayn's rumors of dragons, which is understandable at this point in the story, but it does show a lack of interest at looking at the big picture. 15th, oh my god, final error of the chapter is trusting Osney Kettleblack 5 times over. He's just some dude, and Cersei thinks that if she seduces him, he's going to kill the Pope, seduce Marjorie, get sent to the wall by Tommen, take the Black, and kill Jon Snow. I don't think the most reliable character in all of Westeros would be able to do all of that successfully, let alone this random knight from the Vale who happens to be in Littlefinger's pocket. Oh my god, Cersei. Cersei V is also a big one, but comparably quaint. Cersei ignores Pycelle's warnings against Arayn's plan to man his ships with disloyal criminals, rather than veterans of the Battle of the Blackwater, which does prove to be an error as they abandon her later. 2. As a part of that conversation, she states that no mother should outlive her children. She has already outlived Joffrey, and will likely outlive the others as well if Maggie the Frog's prophecy is accurate. 3rd, Cersei falls for Wyman's false execution of Davos and releases the Mannerly hostages. I can't really blame her for this one. It fooled me when I read Feast for the first time, but it is still an error. Cersei then dismisses the envoy from the Iron Bank, directly leading to this economically powerful organization throwing in behind the one true king, Stannis Baratheon, in A Dance with Dragons. I'm counting this in addition to the original error because it's a chance for her to realize how stupid that initial move was, but she really doesn't take that additional chance. 5. Cersei thinks that Jalabhar Jo is begging Marjorie for money when he's actually teaching her and her cousins languages. 6. Cersei talks about Tommen's father being great at tourney jousting, almost accidentally outing the twincest in one of the funniest exchanges in the entire book or entire book series. She redirects in a totally natural and cool way, though, saying that Robert won the tourney of the Trident, and shame on Marjorie for not realizing that. Owned. 7. Cersei seems to forget that the Red Keep's Master-at-Arms, Aeron Santagar, died in the riot of King's Landing when suggesting that Loras is overreaching his current Kingsguard duties. 8. She dismisses another report of dragons, this time from Qyburn and originating in Meereen, stating that harpies reside in that city, not dragons. 9. I'm going to count the report on Dorne as something that Cersei interprets incorrectly. Qyburn essentially hands her all of the elements of the aftermath of the Queenmaker plot, but she gets bored and dismisses it rather than attempting to piece this interesting full story together. 10. Cersei thinks that the washerwomen are shrinking her gowns, and rather than considering the possibility that they might not fit her any longer. 11. Cersei asserts that Giles Rosby's been dying for years, so he'll be with them for years to come, apparently tempting the stranger if I've ever heard it, as he dies a few chapters later. She then tries to arrange a fatal accident for Bronn out of fear that he's Tyrion's catspaw, but openly admits that the two people she's having arranged this mishap in the first place are drunk fools past their prime. Jaime III is here, and I finally have a real break. Cersei's confined to only the first few pages of this chapter as the Kingslayer leaves King's Landing, and because of this, she's only limited to one error, and that is trying to name Osmond Kettleblack as commander of the Kingsguard in Jaime's absence. That would have been a pretty bad move, as we'll find out later. The Kettleblacks are really not that reliable. Cersei VI. Cersei suspects that the Blue Bard and Margaery are romantically entangled. There's no evidence that this is the case, as is later revealed when she has this Bard tortured. 2. She then assumes that Grand Maester Pycelle's visit to Margaery mean that he's betrayed House Lannister for the Tyrells. He is pretty clearly a Lannister man through and through. 3. Sir Osfryd Kettleblack is named by Cersei to be captain of the Gold Cloaks, as she continues to put all of her eggs in the fairly unproven Kettleblack basket. 4th, Cersei says the Hound's atrocities at Saltpans were ordered by Beric Dondarrion, which is almost impressively wrong. It wasn't the Hound, it was rather Rorge and his helm, and also Beric is dead and has been for some time. Also, the Hound is not working for the Brotherhood, also Rorge is not working for the Brotherhood. 5th, we've arrived at the big one. Cersei's arguably most egregious error, repealing the laws of King Maegor and allowing the Faith to rearm itself. This single move marks both her own direct downfall and likely the downfall of Tommen and the Lannister regime on the whole. Maegor fought a bloody war against the Faith, and only through the negotiations of his nephew Jaehaerys were these peace laws eventually achieved. Cersei undoes them for the sake of convenience and to build some boats. Masterful gambit, Your Grace. Cersei thinks that Tywin couldn't have done better than she did while negotiating with the Faith. Tywin made some really dumb and short-sighted moves, but he would have recognized Cersei's mistake here 100 times over. 7. When explaining the history of the Poor Fellows and the Warrior Sons to Lady Merryweather, Cersei believes they'll be used against Stannis first and foremost, despite the fact that he is very far away from any of these sparrows. 8. And finally, she doubles down on the previous thought that the Tyrells had a hand in Tyrion's escape, thinking that he and Sansa are chilling at Highgarden at this very moment, which, I mean, probably true. She's probably right on that one. Cersei VII. This chapter begins with an impromptu small council meeting as Margaery brings news of Euron Greyjoy's raids on the Reach, for which Cersei Lannister immediately blames Willis Tyrell's injured foot. One paragraph later, Cersei makes my favorite error in the entire book. She asserts that Euron is working for Stannis as a distraction and to gain a foothold in the Reach. I don't know why I'm talking about this one, it's so clearly the objective truth. 3rd, she assumes that the Ironborn will be content with the Shield Isles, which she does call rocks, and Margaery gets very offended at that, and Euron proves this assertion wrong in literally the very next chapter. 4th, she also doubles down on believing that the Northmen hate Stannis and will never support him, citing Wyman Manderly's feigned execution of Sir Davos. It seems like that ploy worked even better than Lord Too Fat to Sit a Horse had expected, and I am very happy about that. 5. Cersei then sends Loras off to retake Dragonstone in the hopes that he'll be killed. It's actually one of her better plans and effectively acts as a win-win for her, but with that said, he doesn't die. He's either heavily wounded or fine, depending on which theories you believe. 6. She's also willing to dismiss every single concern that Pycelle has during this chapter, and frankly during all of her chapters in Feast. And those are often redundant with other mistakes she makes, so I'll count them here as one massive error in addition. 7th and finally for this chapter, Cersei hears noises in her walls and assumes that they're mice. Qyburn says that the walls have ears, despite her assuming this, and we later learn that Varys is likely living in the walls of the Red Keep, making this probably false. Cersei VIII. This one begins with Arryn's report of Dragonstone's fall. I'm going to count fully believing him and verifying none of the relevant information with sources who would know things as an error, as many fans have pointed out that there are more than a few inconsistencies in Lord Waters' story, and that Sir Loras Tyrell may in fact be alive and unhurt. 2. After alienating Marjorie via gleefully bringing her news of the assault, Cersei thinks that Tywin would now deem her a worthy heir. Again, no way to verify this, but I'm of the opinion that his stinky corpse is currently doing barrel rolls under Castle Rock based on everything Cersei is doing. Sidebar here. It's unrelated, but after this, a Tyroshi man, Cersei says, reminds her of Varys, presents a dwarf head, saying that it could be her Valonqar. I honestly think that there's a non-zero chance that that is Varys, fueling the Queen's paranoia and obfuscating Tyrion's whereabouts by giving clearly false information. Third, Cersei thinks that Giles Rosby finally dying of his cough must be someone trying to murder him, probably the Tyrells trying to install Garth the Growth as new Master of Coin. Fourth, Cersei thinks that no harm will come to Tommen while she lives, despite having made him whip a boy until he bled the previous evening. Despite what Mother of the Year over here says, I'm going to count mental harm as harm to Tommen regardless. Fifth, Cersei hatches the plan to have Sir Osney Kettleblack falsely confess to betting Marjorie Tyrell in the hopes that the Faith will arrest the young queen and the prophecy of Maggie the Frog will be forestalled. Cersei IX. This chapter opens with Cersei yelling at Grand Maester Pycelle about Giles Rosby's demise. The mistake I'm counting here is her crediting his incompetence with the deaths of several unrelated figures, most notably Robert, Jon Arryn, and Tywin. Pycelle really couldn't have done anything about any of those, except maybe Robert, but even that's unlikely, and Cersei tried to kill Robert herself. 2. Cersei then asserts that Marjorie commanded Pycelle to kill Giles Rosby, which sounds like a clue answer. Third, she then asserts that Lord Rosby wanted to leave all of his gold and lands to Tommen, something I don't think she ever really gets to follow up on. Maybe she will and wins, but I've always been partial to the idea that she'll flee King's Landing and be refused at Rosby, as Rhaenyra once was. I'm also going to count believing the moon tea Pycelle was making was intended for Marjorie as an error. It's definitely a mistake that serves Cersei's interest, but there are so many women living with Marjorie that it is almost certainly for one of the cousins rather than Marjorie herself. 5. I really don't think the Blue Bard slept with Marjorie. 6. Cersei and Qyburn then torture the Blue Bard, who just spouts a bunch of obvious lies. Cersei clearly doesn't believe them, and she doesn't realize that anyone with a brain would probably see that they were induced by duress. 7. Cersei thinks that all she does for Tommen, which she likely learned from the Walter White, Logan Roy, Tony Soprano School of Delusion. 8th, and finally for this chapter, telling Osney to blatantly lie to the High Sparrow and thinking there's zero chance that him sleeping with Cersei but not with Marjorie might potentially come to light is one of the bigger blunders that Cersei makes in A Feast for Crows. We finally arrived at Cersei's glorious 10th and final chapter. Cersei's plan to frame Marjorie actually goes way better than I'd expected on initial read, at least in its initial goal. However, she does think that Marjorie is done, which does not seem to be the case in The Winds of Winter. We hear that Mace is actively moving on Storm's End in Aerion's second sample chapter, something he said he wouldn't do until his daughter's innocence was proven and she won her trial. 2. She then thinks that successfully framing Marjorie means that Maggie the Frog was a fool who knew nothing, which I think we all know is likely wrong. 3. Cersei then grants Arain Waters permission to launch his new Drummonds for ostensibly no reason, giving him the freedom of movement to abandon her in about a day's time. 4. Cersei decides to go speak to the High Sparrow and Marjorie herself, which goes well. 5. Cersei agrees to let the Faith oversee Marjorie's trial, unknowingly giving them back another power that had been stripped by Jaehaerys, that being the power to preside over trials. Following all of this, Cersei thinks that her plan has worked perfectly and that she'll be allowed to take Sir Osney and return to the Right to Keep happily ever after. 7. When confronted with Osney, she attempts to flee the Sept of Baelor despite the fact that it is overrun with sparrows, septons, and silent sisters. I think that attempting to flee like this likely made her position a fair bit worse, not that it was particularly good to begin with. 8th, she then thinks her Lannister guardmen and Sir Boris Blount are going to be able to rescue her, despite her entire plan for Marjorie's trial by combat hinging on Blount's incompetence. 9. When Qyburn comes to visit her, Cersei begins a sad series of assumptions I'm only going to count as one mistake. Continually, she thinks that her supposed allies are going to be the ones to save her. Taena and Lord Merryweather have fled, Arain Waters has bailed and become a pirate, and everyone except Qyburn has pretty much left her out to dry. The Lioness is well and truly alone, save for her unchained maester. 10th and finally fitting for Cersei's 10th chapter. Her final mistake in A Feast for Crows is thinking that her brother, who she continually mocked, discarded, and dismissed, will champion her in a trial by combat against the Faith that he has no way of winning. Cersei's total number of errors in A Feast for Crows is, drumroll please, ow, I don't know if you could hear that, 87. She made 87 errors in this one fairly short for Song of Ice and Fire book. Her most copious chapter was Cersei IV, as I'm sure you could guess. Her least copious chapter was Jaime III, seeing as she was only on about 3 pages in that chapter. Overall, I don't know if this is more or less than I expected. 87 is a lot of goddamn errors for only having 10 chapters. I am excited to see where she goes in the Winds of Winter, as she is, despite being delusional and very bad at decision making, one of my favorite viewpoint characters. Cersei Lannister is a fantastic character who greatly lifts up the experience of reading A Feast for Crows, and her chapters are always my favorites on rereads. The main thing I want you personally to take away from this video is that Cersei Lannister isn't a Song of Ice and Fire theorist. She is just like the rest of us. She makes outlandish assumptions based on what little information she has, and she is very often wrong about many of the things she theorizes about. I think that she is an icon, and I've heard people say, oh, Marwyn the Mage is the person that Martin intends to be a stand-in, these crazy conspiracy theorist fans. No, I think he's meant someone else, someone much more relatable to be our stand-in, and I think that is Cersei Lannister, because who among us has not made an outlandish, wild conspiracy theory that ended up being completely wrong in every single regard? I love Cersei, and I look forward to having more chapters from her in the future. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. It's free and it really helps me grow the channel. I talk a lot about A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, Dunk and Egg, all that stuff, and I would really appreciate any support on future videos as well. I have many more in the pipeline that I am super duper excited to share with you. A Rhaegar theory I'm very excited about is coming up soon. I am still just working on the script for that one. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the very near future. Goodbye, everyone.